Portuguese Mozambique.Portuguese East Africa are the common terms by which Mozambique is designated when referring to the historic period when it was a Portuguese overseas territory. Former Portuguese Mozambique constituted a string of Portuguese colonies and later a single Portuguese overseas province along the southeast African coast, which now forms the Republic of Mozambique. Portuguese trading settlements and, later, colonies, were formed along the coast from 1498, when Vasco da Gama first reached the Mozambican coast. Lourenço Marques explored the area that is now Maputo Bay in 1544. He settled permanently in present-day Mozambique, where he spent most of his life, and his work was followed by other Portuguese explorers, sailors and traders. Some of these colonies were handed over in the late 19th century for rule by chartered companies such as the Mozambique Company, which had the concession of the lands corresponding to the present-day provinces of Managua and Sofala, and the Niassa Company, which had controlled the lands of the modern provinces of Cabo Delgado and Niassa. In 1951 the colonies were combined into a single overseas province under the name Mozambique as an integral part of Portugal. Most of the original colonies have given the names to the modern provinces of Mozambique. Mozambique, according to official policy, was not a colony at all but rather a part of the pluricontinental and multiracial nation of Portugal. Portugal sought in Mozambique, as it did in all its colonies, to Europeanize the local population and assimilate them into Portuguese culture. Lisbon also wanted to retain the colonies as trading partners and markets for its goods. African inhabitants of the colony were ultimately supposed to become full citizens with full political rights through a long development process. To that end, segregation in Mozambique was minimal compared to that in neighboring South Africa. However, paid forced labor, to which all Africans were liable if they failed to pay head tax, was not abolished until the early 1960s. Designation. During its history, under Portuguese dominion, the present-day territory of Mozambique had the following formal designations: 1501 to 1569, Captaincy of Sofala; 1570 to 1676, Captaincy of Mozambique and Sofala; 1676 to 1836, Captaincy General of Mozambique and Rivers of Sofala; 1836 to 1891, Province of Mozambique; 1891 to 1893, State of Eastern Africa; 1893 to 1926, Province of Mozambique; 1926 to 1951, Colony of Mozambique; 1951 to 1972, Province of Mozambique; 1972 to 1975, State of Mozambique. Overview. Until the 20th century, the land and peoples of Mozambique were barely affected by the Europeans who came to its shores and entered its major rivers, as the Muslim traders, mostly Swahili, were displaced from the coastal centers en route to the interior by the Portuguese. Migrations of Bantu peoples continued and tribal federations formed and reformed as the relative power of local chiefs changed. For 4 centuries the Portuguese presence was meager. Coastal and river trading posts were built, abandoned, and built again. Governors sought personal profits to take back to Portugal, and colonists were not attracted to the distant area with its relatively unattractive climate. Those who stayed were traders who married local women and successfully maintained relations with local chiefs. In Portugal, however, Mozambique was considered to be a vital part of a world empire. Periodic recognition of the relative insignificance of the revenues it could produce was tempered by the mystique which developed regarding the mission of the Portuguese to bring the civilization to the African territory. It was believed that through missionary activity and other direct contact between Africans and Europeans, the Africans could be taught to appreciate embrace and participate in Portuguese culture. In the last decade of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, integration of Mozambique into the structure of the Portuguese nation was begun. After all of the area of the present province had been recognized by other European powers as belonging to Portugal, pacification of the tribes of the interior was completed and the traditional holders of political power were subordinated to the Portuguese. Civil administration was established throughout the area, the building of an infrastructure was begun, and agreements regarding the transit trade of Mozambique's landlocked neighbors to the west were made. Portugal never officially had a racist policy or sanctioned discrimination based on race. Its concept of what it called a multiracial society envisaged complete racial integration, including intermarriage, as well as cultural adaptation. The historically determined position of the Portuguese as conquerors and governors of the Africans, however, resulted in barriers to the formation of this ideal. The fact that most Africans were not cultivated in the Portuguese sense, and that many participated in what were considered by the Portuguese to be pagan beliefs and uncivilized behavior, tended to create a low opinion of Africans as a group. The uneducated Portuguese immigrant peasants in urban areas were frequently in direct competition with Africans for jobs and demonstrated jealousies and prejudices with racial overtones. The society was divided into two peripherally interrelated sectors. The urban-based modern sector, comprising altogether between 2 and 2.5% of the population, consisting mostly of Europeans but including a few thousand Europeanized Africans, Indians, and Chinese, was dominant in the economic, political, and social realms. Communication between this sector and the large majority of rural Africans was limited. Only a small proportion of the Africans could speak Portuguese, the language of the administration and the modern economic sector. Communication between members of the 10 different major ethno-linguistic groups was also difficult. Economically and socially, all but a few educated and Europeanized Africans were at a disadvantage vis-à-vis the Europeans. Access to education above the primary level was limited by lack of means, by age limitations, or by lack of sufficient preparations. Access to economic opportunity was limited by lack of adequate training. Between the modern urban and traditional rural sectors of the society was a steadily increasing group of Africans who were loosening the ties with the village and starting to participate in the money economy, to settle in suburbs, and to adopt new customs. This transitional group included individuals who had acquired a modicum of education or skills and some of the aspirations associated with the modern European way of life. Many of them, especially those who had an education beyond the primary level, were more alert politically than the majority of the population, who are either unaware of or uninterested in political issues. It was members of this group, allied with forward-looking European leaders and intellectuals, who had shown the greatest interest in reforms and benefits for the African population. Some among them left the country to become active participants in the independence movement. History. When Portuguese explorers reached East Africa in 1498, Swahili commercial settlements had existed along the coast and outlying islands for several centuries. From about 1500, Portuguese trading posts and forts became regular ports of call on the new route to the east. The voyage of Vasco da Gama around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean in 1498 marked the Portuguese entry into trade, politics, and society in the Indian Ocean world. The Portuguese gained control of the island of Mozambique and the port city of Sofala in the early 16th century. The Vasco da Gama, having visited Mombasa in 1498, was then successful in reaching India, and this permitted the Portuguese to trade with the Far East directly by sea, thus challenging older trading networks of mixed land and sea routes, such as the spice trade routes that used the Persian Gulf, Red Sea in caravans to reach the eastern Mediterranean. The Republic of Venice had gained control over much of the trade routes between Europe and Asia, after traditional land routes to India had been closed by the Ottoman Turks. Portugal hoped to use the sea route pioneered by da Gama to break the Venetian trading monopoly. Initially, Portuguese rule in East Africa focused mainly on a coastal strip centered in Mombasa, with voyages led by Vasco da Gama, Francisco de Almeida and Afonso de Albuquerque. The Portuguese dominated much of Southeast Africa's coast, including Sofala and Kilwa, by 1515. The main goal was to dominate trade with India. As the Portuguese settled along the coast, they made their way into the hinterland as Sertanejos. These Sertanejos lived alongside Swahili traders and even took up service among Shona kings as interpreters and political advisors. One such Sertanejo managed to travel through almost all the Shona kingdoms, including the Mutapa Empire's metropolitan district, between 1512 and 1516. By the 1530s, smaller groups of Portuguese traders and prospectors penetrated the interior regions seeking gold, where they set up garrisons and trading posts at Sina and Tete on the Zambezi River and tried to gain exclusive control over the gold trade. The Portuguese finally entered into direct relations with the Mwene Mutapa in the 1560s. They recorded a wealth of information about the Mutapa Kingdom as well as its predecessor, Great Zimbabwe, according to Swahili traders, whose accounts were recorded by the Portuguese historian João de Barros. Great Zimbabwe was an ancient capital city built of stones of marvelous size without the use of mortar, and while the site was not within Mutapa's borders, the Mwene Mutapa kept noblemen and some of his wives there. The Portuguese attempted to legitimate and consolidate the trade and settlement positions through the creation of prezos tied to Portuguese settlement and administration. While prezos were originally developed to be held by Portuguese, through intermarriage they became African Portuguese or African Indian centers defended by large African slave armies known as Chikandar. Historically, within Mozambique there was slavery. Human beings were bought and sold by African tribal chiefs, Arab traders, and the Portuguese. Many Mozambican slaves were supplied by tribal chiefs who raided warring tribes and sold the captives to the prezeiros. Although Portuguese influence gradually expanded, its power was limited and exercised through individual settlers and officials who were granted extensive autonomy. The Portuguese were able to wrest much of the coastal trade from Arabs between 1500 and 1700, but, with the Arab seizure of Portugal's key foothold at Fort Jesus on Mombasa Island in 1698, the pendulum began to swing in the other direction. As a result, investment lagged while Lisbon devoted itself to the more lucrative trade with India and the Far East and to the colonization of Brazil. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Mazrui and Omani Arabs reclaimed much of the Indian Ocean trade, forcing the Portuguese to retreat south. Many prezos had declined by the mid-19th century, but several of them survived. During the 19th century, other European powers, particularly the British and the French, became increasingly involved in the trade and politics of the region. In the island of Mozambique, the hospital, a majestic neoclassical building constructed in 1877 by the Portuguese, with a garden decorated with ponds and fountains, was for many years the biggest hospital south of the Sahara. By the early 20th century, the Portuguese had shifted the administration of much of Mozambique to large private companies, like the Mozambique Company, the Zambezia Company and the Nyasa Company, controlled and financed mostly by the British, which established, with the Portuguese, railroad lines to neighboring countries. The companies, granted a charter by the Portuguese government to foster economic development and maintain Portuguese control in the territory's provinces, would lose the purpose when the territory was transferred to the control of the Portuguese colonial government between 1929 and 1942. Although slavery had been legally abolished in Mozambique by the Portuguese authorities, at the end of the 19th century the chartered companies enacted a forced labor policy and supplied cheap, often forced, African labor to the mines and plantations of the nearby British colonies and South Africa. The Zambezia Company, the most profitable chartered company, took over a number of smaller Cruzeiro holdings, and requested Portuguese military outposts to protect its property. The chartered companies and the Portuguese administration built roads and ports to bring the goods to market, including a railroad linking present-day Zimbabwe with the Mozambican port of Beira. However, the Development Administration gradually started to pass directly from the trading companies to the Portuguese government itself, because of their unsatisfactory performance and because of the shift, under the Estado Novo regime of Oliveira Salazar, towards a stronger Portuguese control of the Portuguese Empire's economy. The company's concessions were not renewed when they ran out. This was what happened in 1942 with the Mozambique Company, which however continued to operate in the agricultural and commercial sectors as a corporation, and had already happened in 1929 with the termination of the Nyasa Company's concession. In the 1950s, the Portuguese overseas colony was rebranded an overseas province of Portugal, and by the early 1970s it was officially upgraded to the status of Portuguese non-sovereign state, by which it would remain a Portuguese territory but with a wider administrative autonomy. The Front for the Liberation of Mozambique initiated a guerrilla campaign against Portuguese rule in September 1964. This conflict, along with the two others already initiated in the other Portuguese colonies of Angola and Guinea, became part of the so-called Portuguese Colonial War. From a military standpoint, the Portuguese regular army held the upper hand during all of the conflicts against the independentist guerrilla forces, which created favorable conditions for social development and economic growth until the end of the conflict in 1974. After 10 years of sporadic warfare and after Portugal's return to democracy through a leftist military coup in Lisbon which replaced Portugal's Estado Novo regime in favor of a military junta, Frelimo took control of the territory. The talks that led to an agreement on Mozambique's independence, signed in Lusaka, were started. Within a year, almost all ethnic Portuguese population had left, many fleeing in fear, others were expelled by the ruling power of the newly independent territory. Mozambique became independent from Portugal on the 25th of June 1975. Government, at least since the early 19th century, the legal status of Mozambique always considered it as much a part of Portugal as Lisbon, but as an overseas province enjoyed special derogations to account for its distance from Europe. From 1837, the highest government official in the province of Mozambique has always been the Governor-General, who reported directly to the government in Lisbon, usually through the Minister of the Overseas. During some periods in the late 19th and the early 20th century, the Governors-General of Mozambique received the status of Royal Commissioner governors or of high commissioners, which gave them extended executive and legislative powers, equivalent to those of a government minister. In the 20th century, the province was also subject to the authoritarian Estado Novo regime that ruled Portugal from 1933 to 1974, until the military coup at Lisbon, known as the Carnation Revolution. Most members of the government of Mozambique were from Portugal, but a few were Africans. Nearly all members of the bureaucracy were from Portugal, as most Africans did not have the necessary qualifications to obtain positions. The government of Mozambique, as it was in Portugal, was highly centralized. Power was concentrated in the executive branch, and all elections where they occurred were carried out using indirect methods. For the Prime Minister's office in Lisbon, authority extended down to the most remote posts and regadorias of Mozambique through a rigid chain of command. The authority of the government of Mozambique was residual, primarily limited to implementing policies already decided in Europe. In 1967, Mozambique also sent 7 delegates to the National Assembly in Lisbon. The highest official in the province was the Governor-General, appointed by the Portuguese cabinet on recommendation of the Overseas Minister. The Governor-General had both executive and legislative authority. A government council advised the Governor-General in the running of the province. The functional cabinet consisted of 5 secretaries appointed by the Overseas Minister on the advice of the governor. A legislative council had limited powers and its main activity was approving the provincial budget. Finally, an economic and social council had to be consulted on all draft legislation, and the Governor-General had to justify his decision to Lisbon if he ignored its advice. Mozambique was divided into 9 districts, which were further subdivided into 61 municipalities and 33 circumscriptions. Each subdivision was then made up of 3 or 4 individual posts, 166 in all, with an average of 40,000 Africans in each. Each district, except Lourenço Marques, which was run by the Governor-General, was overseen by a governor. Most Africans only had contact with the Portuguese through the post administrator, who was required to visit each village in his domain at least once a year. The lowest level of administration was the regadoria, settlements inhabited by Africans living according to customary law. Each regadoria was run by a regulo, an African or Portuguese official chosen on the recommendation of local residents. Under the regulos, each village had its own African headman. Each level of government could also have an advisory board or council. They were established in municipalities with more than 500 electors, in smaller municipalities as circumscriptions with more than 300 electors, and in posts with more than 20 electors. Each district also had its own board as well. 2 legal systems were in force: Portuguese civil law and African customary law. As part of its policy of assimilation, the Portuguese sought to break down the African legal system and did not study or codify much of it. Until 1961, Africans were considered to be indigenous or natives, rather than citizens. After 1961, the previous native laws were repealed and Africans gained de facto Portuguese citizenship. From then on, the status of Africans depended merely on whether or not they chose to be governed by civil law, and the number of Africans that made their choice was very small. Geography. Portuguese East Africa was located in southeastern Africa. It was a long coastal strip with Portuguese strongholds, from current-day Tanzania and Kenya to the south of current-day Mozambique. In 1900, the part of modern Mozambique northwest of the Zambezi and Shire rivers was called Mocambique. The rest of it was Lourenço Marques. Various districts existed, and even issued stamps, during the first part of the century, including in Hambane, Lourenço Marques, Mozambique Colony, Mozambique Company, Nyasa Company, Quelimane, and Zambezia. The Nyassa Company territory is now Cabo Delgado and Nyassa. In the early and mid-20th century, a number of changes occurred. Firstly, on the 28th of June 1919, the Treaty of Versailles transferred the Kayonga Triangle, a 1,000 square kilometers territory south of the Rovuma River, from German East Africa to Mozambique. During World War II, the charter of the Mozambique Company expired. On the 19th of July 1942, its territory, known as Managua and Sofala, became a district of Mozambique. Mozambique was constituted as 4 districts on the 1st of January 1943, Managua and Sofala, Nyassa, Salda Save, and Zambezia. On the 20th of October 1954, administrative reorganization caused Cabo Delgado and Mozambique districts to be split from Nyassa. At the same time, the Salda Save district was divided into Gaza, Inhambane and Lourenço Marques, while the Tet district was split from Managua and Sofala. By the early 1970s, Mozambique was bordering the Mozambique Channel, bordering the countries of Malawi, Rhodesia, South Africa, Swaziland, Tanzania, and Zambia, covering a total area of 801,590 square kilometers. With a tropical to subtropical climate, the Zambezi flows through the north-central and most fertile part of the country. Its coastline had 2,470 kilometers, with 4,571 kilometers of land boundaries. Its highest point at Monte Binga, the Gorongosa National Park, founded in 1920, was the main natural park in the territory. The districts with its respective capitals were Lourenço Marques, Gaza, João Belo, Inhambane, Beira, Vila Peri, Tet, Zambezia, Quelimane, Moçambique, Nampula, Cabo Delgado, Porto Amelia, Nyassa, Vila Cabral. Other important urban centers included Sofala, Nacala, Antonio and East Island of Mozambique and Vila Junqueiro. Demographics. By 1970, the Portuguese overseas province of Mozambique had about 18,168,933 inhabitants. Nearly 300,000 were white ethnic Portuguese. There was a number of mulattoes, from both European and African ancestry, living across the territory. However, the majority of the population belonged to local tribal groups which included the Makua Lomwe, the Shona and the Songa. Other ethnic minorities included British, Greeks, Chinese and Indians. Most inhabitants were black indigenous Africans with a diversity of ethnic and cultural backgrounds, ranging from Shangaan and Makon to Laos Shona peoples. The Makua were the largest ethnic group in the north. The Sena and Shona were prominent in the Zambezi Valley, and the Shangaan dominated in the south. In addition, several other minority groups lived a tribal lifestyle across the territory. Mozambique had around 250,000 Europeans in 1974 that made up around 3% of the population. Mozambique was cosmopolitan as it had around Indian, Chinese, Greek and Anglophone communities living the two. The white population was more influenced from South Africa. The capital of Portuguese Mozambique, Lourenço Marques, had a population of 355,000 in 1970 with around 100,000 Europeans. Beira had around 115,000 inhabitants at the time with around 30,000 Europeans. Most of the other cities ranged from 10 to 15% in the number of Europeans, while Portuguese Angola cities had European majorities ranging from 50% to 60%.